So, as people know, Nerdrotic has become infamous for basically demonizing a lot of Hollywood. And I would concede Gary has read Lord of the Rings, although I don't think he understood them or read them carefully. And he's become a big critic of the Amazon series on the basis of very little evidence, too, by the way. He just goes with rumors and his own very weird interpretation of events. So we're just going to have some fun here, but this does explore a serious issue in the lore and a lot of misunderstandings. And to be fair, it's mostly his guests who are idiots, but apparently he doesn't know any better. His knowledge here is very weak. So they're going to be discussing the rings of power in the posters, and they basically make a lot of errors. So we're going to hear them ramble on and then try to work through this issue.
There is a suspicious amount of women.
Is this a woman?
There's a
No.
suspicious amount of women.
I mean, like all the, they were given to the 9 human kings, and they were given to the dwarven kings, and they were given to the elven kings. So it would make sense that there were lots of women involved in the ring distribution.
Because is this supposed to be showing all of the rings of power?
Yeah,
I don't think
that's what I would pay. I would guess,
Because it's
right?
9 men,
They don't all
the
have
7 men, the 7 male dwarves,
No.
and then it was one female elf.
There's 20 altogether with the Ring of Power. So
Yeah.
I don't know how many pictures. I didn't count it.
Yeah.
I know
it's
one's on a necklace.
25 or 21.
Yeah. So somebody ain't got one.
So wait, if there's 21, it would be including the Ring of Power, right? Which should be on Sauron.
But the 9,
Which is right
it
there.
has to be. Well, see, those are tiny hands right there. So that's
Tiny little hands.
that is a
So
tiny.
they may
it's
not
played
have
by
all
Marco
of the,
Rubio.
I'm going to use my strong hand.
He was fair, right?
Those are tiny Trump hands.
No, I think it's Lauron, Sauron's
Look at these hands.
sister, who actually designed the ring. She designed the ring for him,
Right.
and taught him
It
how
wasn't
to use it.
Celebrimbor.
Yeah, no, he wasn't.
didn't forge it,
They haven't
no.
even. We don't know if he's
That
even
was
going to be in this.
Celebrimborina.
I wouldn't be surprised if they give a lot of his stuff to freaking Galadriel. It would be ridiculous, but we've got hobbits.
Why
in
does
the
that
second
dude have
age,
a
so why not?
broken sword?
It's the sword that
Well, Gary was at least correct initially. There are, quote, 20 rings of power. The way it breaks down is 7 for one group, 9 for another, then 3, and then we have the Sauron ring, which dominates the other rings. Now, 3 of the rings go to the elves. It is stated in a verse they go to the, quote, elf kings. That's not what happened. Technically, 2 of the rings were given to an elf king. Those rings were then handed off to 2 lords. So technically, there's some gaps in the canon. In terms of the men, I don't think it's stated that every man was a king. It might be plausible, but that seems highly unlikely. As far as I understand it, in the lore, it was a mix of warriors, lords, possibly a king. We just don't know the identity of the 9. We really don't. I've already covered this. Like the Witch King, for instance, it would seem likely he was a king, but we don't know. We don't know who he is. We know one of the ring bearers. They're given a name, but we're not really told explicitly the origins. So where he's getting that the 9 rings were given to 9 human kings, I have no idea. He's just making that up. In terms of the dwarves, in the verse it's stated that dwarf lords are given the rings, not kings. They don't really seem to know the canon, but even beyond that, they're not getting the numbers right. And again, to be fair to Gary, this is Ryan Kinel. Ryan Kinel says, there are 21 rings. And Gary's like, yeah, you're right, 21 rings. But Gary had said there were 20 rings and got confused. I guess he's adding Sauron's ring to the 20 rings. And that's what Ryan did. He says, oh, there's 21 rings. And Gary's agreeing there are 21 rings. In terms of, quote, the rings of power that Sauron tricked people into creating, those are 20. Now, in terms of the poster art, people are already getting up in arms because, like, there are 22 rings. It doesn't make any sense. We have to differentiate the rings of power that Sauron helped create. Those are 20. Those are not the only rings, quote, of power in existence. There are magical rings beyond those 20 rings. Those are not the only magical rings within the lore. Those 20 rings are, quote unquote, associated with Sauron. They're not the only magical rings that ever existed. There are, quote, other magical rings. They're just not talked about very much as the other rings. There's not any necessary conflict with the canon or the lore. I guess they're assuming the rings being shown are the rings of power. Well, we don't know that. I mean, again, if I'll concede if they're right and I'm wrong that they screwed up the lore, but I don't think we know. So they're making a lot of leaps here. But even if we put all that aside, they've definitely got the canon wrong, because there just aren't these 21 rings of power. There are 20 rings of power. So it seems that they're not quite sure how to number the rings, and also they make this kind of sexist comment saying, "Huh, what are the women going to get the rings?" Well, yeah, Galadriel has one of the rings. That's pretty basic. That's basal knowledge. Like, if you don't know Galadriel, that's just obvious. Like, yeah, Galadriel has one of the rings. If you're a basic fan, they state this very explicitly. That's why the elves have preserved themselves. Their rings have that power. They've been able to maintain their realm through the rings. If you're not paying attention, you don't know that. But Gary claims he read the books, so either he read them but doesn't really understand them, or he read them but read them really carelessly and just concentrated on the action adventure and is just assuming these things. But even if we put all that aside, he doesn't even get the numbers right, or even what the rings are for, or who they were given to. He just seems all completely confused. Again, it's just he's getting lazy. He's presumably relying on memory or the Peter Jackson films, but those are not canonical. He changed a whole lot of things, so I guess he assumes when we see the 9 men, those 9 men were kings because of the way they're framed. That's all well and good for Peter Jackson. Doesn't have anything to do with the canon or the lore or what Tolkien wanted. And there's a lot of confusions here. But the Rings of Power are critical, so we should get them right. But again, primarily a symbol. And I'll admit my own error. I thought the rings represented power, but actually Tolkien clarified that no, for him it was about death. Death is the theme running throughout these books. So, okay. So again, as a Tolkien analyst, you have to admit you're going to make interpretive mistakes. So if he says it's primarily about death, again, we don't have to agree with him, but that's what the author states. We have to work through that. Yeah, Gary not knowing basic math. So Gary's getting some basic things wrong about the rings, basic things wrong about the lore. He just seems very, very confused overall about what the rings are, what they represent, or what Tolkien wanted within the story. He may have some legitimate complaints and criticisms, but this is a complete mess. So his critique of posters is just ridiculous. It's illiterate. It's contradicting what Tolkien said. So if we have to choose between Nerdrotic and Tolkien, I'm afraid Tolkien is going to have to get priority here, because if he tells us it's 20, it's 20. It's not 22. It's not 21. Ryan Kinel can say they're 21. I don't care. Doesn't matter. Nerdrotic can agree it's 21. Doesn't matter either. They're not 21. They're 20 rings of power. That's the canon. Either you understand this or you don't understand this. Galadriel having one of the rings, being a powerful woman, also, that is the canon. If you don't like it, don't read the books.